When it comes to games that feature disturbing content, Deltarune is probably one of the last things that comes to mind for most people. So far, the game is, for the most part, fairly lighthearted, and even though the story has been going in more of a serious direction with the release of Chapter 4, by no means is Deltarune a disturbing or unsettling game. As many of you may know, I've already talked about Deltarune on this channel before, and moving forward, a lot of my content will be focused on Deltarune. In places like the comments section, people have accused me of glazing the game when I say things like, oh, it's my favorite game of all time and things like that, but truth be told, I mean what I say. Some people may perceive it as glazing, and you know what, that's fair. But Deltarune really is my favorite game. I've been a fan of the game since Chapter 1 came out, and watching this game grow and evolve ever since then over years is honestly kind of beautiful. That's not to say that my previous favorite games are bad at all. For example, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring are still very much within my top list of favorite games. However, I think Deltarune has them all beat. But with Deltarune being my #1 favorite game of all time, I'm happy that my previous Deltarune video on this channel ended up becoming the most popular one by a landslide. I'm happy I got to put out a work of love dedicated to this game on YouTube, even if I wish I did better on the actual analysis. Damn, I've gone on this long about how much I love Deltarune, and yet I still wonder why people accuse me of glazing the game. Despite what I said earlier, though, Deltarune does not specifically adhere to a pattern. Just because the game generally isn't creepy or disturbing doesn't mean it lacks any creepy or disturbing moments. I mean, hell, the Weird Route is far more disturbing than most actual horror games I've played. Speaking of the Weird Route, though, you might remember that in my Weird Route video, if you've watched it, a significant chunk of it was dedicated to Chapter 3, despite there not really being any actual Weird Route content in Chapter 3. That's because, despite the lack of actual route content, there is one rather large section of the chapter that very much is related to the Weird Route. One that has stuck with me ever since I first played through Chapter 3 on launch. A series of minigames that genuinely reminded me of old creepypastas and how, as a kid, I used to be up late at night because I was scared of them. A minigame that brought back that same feeling of fear within me. I'm of course talking about the MANTLE minigame. The MANTLE minigame is, in my opinion, perhaps the most disturbing piece of side content Deltarune has to offer that isn't the Weird Route. It leaves some rather disturbing implications about the protagonist of the game, Chris. It has very notable and definitely intentional parallels to the Weird Route. It leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions, and ultimately it leaves the player with a memorable but disturbing experience, one that they're not going to forget for a very long time. What I plan to do in this video is to take a look back at the MANTLE minigame, recap on everything that really happens during it, and try to figure out if I can put together any meaning for a lot of this stuff. I can't guarantee that my analysis will be perfect exactly. After all, I am an amateur, but I'll do my best to try and make it interesting. To get all the usual stuff out of the way before we start, be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, hype it maybe, comment, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in this kind of stuff, although you don't have to, and feel free to check out my socials such as Discord, Twitter, or Blue Sky. I'll link them all in the description. Before we begin though, I would also like to give a special thanks to a certain few people. First up is TheAutumnLeaf, who actually drew the new avatar for the channel.
I spent like a fucking week on these things. You better fucking like them. Also, Gussie is really cool. She paid me the big bucks to make these things.
Autumn is a supremely talented artist, and I cannot recommend her work enough. I'll make sure to link her in the description. The next person I would like to give a special thanks to is Elin. She's actually the one who drew my current profile picture. I absolutely love how it turned out. She's overall very fun to talk to, very Swedish, and a very talented artist. She doesn't really have any socials for me to link at the moment, but still, shout out to her. Lastly, a special thank you to Folly. She's another member of the community who helped me out, and specifically she voiced a character in this video. a character whose name I've mispronounced multiple times before. So I'll make sure to link Folly in the description as well. And so, now that everything is out of the way, let us dive into MANTLE, Deltarune's most disturbing minigame. Out of all of the hidden side quests in Deltarune, the whole MANTLE minigame side quest is probably the one that's most likely to be run into by complete accident. In order to unlock it, there are a few ways you can go about it, all of which have to do with the first board of Chapter 3. The first option is to win an S rank or higher, the second is to earn a Z rank, and the third option is to just buy an S rank from a Pippin's for 1000 points. It doesn't really matter which one you do for the sake of the quest, however, for the sake of the video, I will be assuming that the player will have accessed the minigame via either the first or third method. When you go to enter the S-rank exclusive room, Susie and Rouse assume it's just a bathroom and decide to just play games while Chris is in there. After that, you can then have Chris talk to the guard who tells you to enjoy the luxury facilities inside. Now this is some absolute peak luxury. Turns out the reward you get for S rank, one of the highest ranks possible on any of the boards, is just this dingy, rundown little changing area. One that Chris can't even use because they're not part of the show technically. Well, they are, but they're one of the contestants, so they have nothing to put on. Back here you'll also find Ram, which given his accent makes sense because this is what the average British home looks like. I really shouldn't be making that joke. About 5% of my audience comes from the UK. I don't want to lose all of them. Ram talks in a very secret boss coded way before then offering Chris a trip backstage. A chance to see the original game that the boards were based on, without any of Tenna's restrictions, without any linearity, just the freedom for Chris to do whatever they want. It's worth noting before we continue just how manipulative Ram is being here. Yes, I'm aware about how much Ram really does care about Chris. I'm by no means trying to say that Ram is being malicious in any way here. However, it's very clear throughout the entire game just how much Chris wants their own personal freedom and autonomy. Even if we, the player, don't have full 100% control over Chris, we take away a good portion of their agency throughout the game. The only time Chris is able to fully act of their own free will is when the soul is torn out of them, but at the same time, it's highly hinted to be extremely dangerous for Chris to go without the soul for too long. And even with everything aside, the normal ending of Chapter 4 seems to imply that Chris is either being coerced or basically held at gunpoint by the voice on the phone. So in this moment, Ram is actively using Chris's lack of true freedom in order to try and persuade them into going backstage, tempting them with the promise of true freedom. Again, I do not think Ram is actively malicious here, however, it is worth pointing all of this out. Especially considering that the promise of freedom ends up being an empty one because, spoiler alert, the game does not offer Chris true freedom. The backstage area is quiet, it's dark, and over to the left there's a game console.
Looks like a game console. Play it.
No controller.
Walking to the right, though, you end up finding a controller on the ground. Notably, it's said to have yellow and pink buttons. Wait a minute. Yellow and pink? Well, we'll talk about that later. What matters now is that we now have access to the game.
No controller.
Before we even get into the contents of the first minigame, it's worth noting how Chris only puts the controller in after they're told that there's no controller. This completely skips the title sequence of the game, and not to mention, every single time the game is loaded up, they do this. It's not just a one-time thing. It's by no means the only instance of Chris keeping things from the player, but it makes one wonder, what exactly is Chris trying to hide here? Why do they not want us to see the title of the game? That question, unfortunately, doesn't really seem to have a clear answer at the moment. At first, there's no music in the game. The layout is pretty much a one-to-one copy of Board 1 as well, except now there's a bunch of different monsters roaming around. It's not exactly clear what you're supposed to do until you end up finding something. You end up gaining a sword, and now there's finally music in the area at least. The music takes on a very similar style to the main theme of the original NES Legend of Zelda, and the sword itself also functions in a very similar way to the swords in the Legend of Zelda NES. At first, all of the monsters are completely passive towards you until you kill your first one. After that, all of the enemies begin attacking. The flowers basically function like the Zoras from the original Legend of Zelda. The fish just move around in a set pattern in the water. The pink monsters just roam around aimlessly like moblins. The yellow monsters do the same thing but also shoot projectiles like Octoroks do. And you pretty much get the idea. By no means is it the most complex thing in the world, but I really do appreciate the homage to Zelda NES. But then again, maybe I'm biased because Zelda is one of my hyperfixations and I grew up with the series. It's worth noting though that some monsters are only able to be attacked once you get this little thing, your LV, high enough. For those new to Undertale and Deltarune lore, or for those who just haven't played Undertale in a while, LV/love is short for level of violence. It's increased through gaining EXP, or execution points. EXP is only gained by killing monsters. An increased level of violence means you become stronger but also more detached, and the more detached you become, the easier it is to keep killing. It's made pretty explicitly clear that the higher your LV is in Undertale, the more morally bankrupt you kinda are in that playthrough. This is already pretty thoroughly explored in the game's genocide route, as well as all of Sans' different Judgment Hall dialogues. However, in Deltarune, references to EXP and love are made much more sparingly. The weird route, as disturbing as it is and as many parallels to Undertale's Gena route it has, never explicitly mentions any of these things. This is different. LV is explicitly name-dropped here, and it functions basically the exact same way as it did in Undertale, so even though these seem to just be mindless enemies wandering around and attacking, are they really? The whole point of Undertale's genocide route was that the enemies are more than just that. They're characters in the game's world, people with lives, families, hopes, dreams, fears. So, I beg the question, is it the same in this little minigame? Are these in-game enemies just another form of Darkner? I mean, we can't really justify killing them. They don't start attacking us until we kill one of them. If anything, we're the ones who provoked them. We instigated this. But then again, the game doesn't really give us any other option. You can't quit the game or leave it at all until you've killed all of them. So for now, you just have to keep wandering the board, keep killing, until eventually the music stops and your LV has reached its max. The only sound to accompany you is just the sound of the waves. That's it. Now there are no enemies left, and with this, it becomes apparent just how empty everything is. It feels uncanny, almost. It feels wrong. In both the Board 1 minigame and the minigame up to this point, the board was filled up with stuff to do, so seeing it completely barren and empty, it just feels weird. Out of sheer boredom, you may decide to try and whack a tree with your sword, only to then discover that at max level, you're able to destroy the trees themselves. Going west reveals a secret area, something flies off screen, and it leaves text behind that's mostly hidden in the darkness. All it says is, "See you soon. Maybe we're not so alone after all." But with this new revelation that you can now destroy the trees to get out of bounds, your curiosity is naturally going to spike. Moving past one of the screens after breaking the barrier trees reveals a looping area, one filled with nothing but trees. No matter which way you go, it'll loop, until you find it. The minigame becomes inaccessible until the next board is completed. By this point, it's hard to exactly gauge what Chris is feeling during this. As I've said before, they're a very taciturn character. They don't really express their emotions all that much. But I did notice that as soon as it ends, they immediately turn back to face us, the player. Additionally, the sound used in the minigame to mark your progression in LV is very, very similar to the sound used in the weird route to mark progression. Aside from one of them being bit crunched and lacking echo, they sound almost identical. Additionally, in this minigame, every single song used is written in all caps. This might seem fairly trivial, but remember, this is Deltarune we're talking about. Toby Fox and the rest of the development team for Deltarune named every single file and made every single thing the way they did, knowing full well people were going to pick apart every single little detail with data mining. And this is by no means the first time Toby Fox has hidden something in the code of Deltarune. And plus, every single gameplay mechanic is in some way a part of the game's narrative and story, so every single little detail put into the game means something. Specifically, the songs in Deltarune are named in a very specific way. The ones named in all caps in particular are very much tied to the mysterious narrator found outside of the main story, the one who seems to be responsible for summoning the player into the world of Deltarune, the one who's seemingly behind the survey program itself, and who is very likely to be Dr. W.D. Gaster himself. Adding further onto the connection, a lot of these songs explicitly tied to the mysterious narrator also share Gaster's motif. Probably the biggest and most explicit of all of these is Another Hymn, the song used in the vessel creation sequence. It may be the most explicit reference to Gaster's theme, given that the name of the track directly references the file name for Gaster's theme, as well as the fact that the main melody is pretty much the same as Gaster's motif, just slowed down. However, it is by no means the only song to contain Gaster's motif in it, and in specific for this minigame, the track Sword contains this one little segment in it that very much sounds similar to Gaster's motif. I will admit, chances are very likely that this is just a coincidence. I could just be reading way too much into this, especially given that the file name for the sword music doesn't really match the file naming conventions of all the tracks tied to the narrator. In the game engine for Deltarune itself, the vast majority of files that seem to be tied to the mysterious narrator always have some sort of unusual prefix before their proper name. For example, instead of having music underscore before the name of the file, they'll have audio underscore before the name of the file. Or as another example, for objects/NPCs that are tied to the mysterious narrator, instead of having the prefix of object underscore, they would instead have the prefix of device underscore. So without this naming convention applying to the sword music, any connections made between this minigame and the mysterious narrator/Gaster are, as Jaru would say, dubious. However, I still figured it was worth pointing out. And regardless, there definitely seems to be something in the game with Chris. What exactly it is at this moment not exactly known. However, based on the tone of what it says to Chris in its hidden message, it seems almost cocky, smug even. And there's a very real possibility that I think is very likely that the entire time we were playing the minigame, this thing was secretly following us around and observing our actions. And while we don't know if this thing is connected to Gaster or not, it does have pretty clear design parallels to one thing that we do know is tied to Gaster. The silhouette of this thing very loosely resembles device underscore friend, which in itself is a very enigmatic character. All we really know about Friend is that it's going to be important, and that it seems to be tied to both the shelter and Dess's disappearance. As another parallel, they're both found in hidden areas, and both of their bodies are completely pitch black and obscured. The fact that their bodies are pitch black alone already aligns them a good bit with characters like the Knight or the Titan, which we know have to be tied to the depths. The Knight especially has design parallels with Gaster himself as well as the Goners from Undertale, especially with the holes in its hands. Granted, this is under the assumption that the Mystery Man sprite from Undertale is Gaster himself, which is not confirmed, and as of this moment, we do not have an official canon design for Gaster. However, with all of this in mind, it could be loosely argued that this entity in the game has something to do with Gaster. But the fact of the matter is, at this point in the minigame, we don't have enough information yet. So, I think it's best we move on to the second part of it.
No controller.
Much like the previous part of the minigame, the second board is pretty much a one-to-one clone in terms of layout of board 2 from chapter 3. One small thing I did notice is that any entrance to a cave or indoor room always takes you back to the same area, and then when you leave it, it takes you to the place you start the board in the normal portion of chapter 3. I'm not sure of the significance of this, or if there even is any significance, but I thought it was too interesting to not bring up here. Killing all of the enemies and stuff plays out pretty much the exact same way as the previous part of the minigame, so I won't bore you too much with the details. But one important thing to note is that when you kill all of the enemies out in the overworld, the minigame is not over. In fact, you're not even at max level when you clear them all out. From there, you're able to raft over to the northernmost part of the area. This part of the area can be found during the normal portion of this board in the chapter, however, it's only while Tenna is gone, and there's not really much you can explore here. If you try going here while Tenna is with you, he'll repeatedly emphasize that the area is apparently unfinished before blocking it off if you keep trying to go to it. Based on the tone of Tenna's dialogue during that part, he seems almost frantic, panicked even. He clearly has something to hide related to this area. There's something about it that he doesn't want anybody to see. There's also one cave entrance that's very easy to miss. If you go inside, it leaves you one message. Go to Northern Light. Now, where have I heard of Northern Light before? Chapter 3, The Isles of Northern Light. The heroes travel across the islands and get a glimpse of a lost land. Okay, before this analysis continues, I would just like to issue everybody a genuine apology that you had just had to listen to my awful attempt to voice act Gerson Boom. I didn't want to inconvenience anybody by suddenly asking them to voice that character, so I decided to do it myself, and yeah, I'm not exactly the greatest at voice acting. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry you had to listen to me do the Hammer of Justice dirty. I'm sorry. Jokes aside, there has to be at least some significance to the Northern Light. Gerson's book, Lord of the Hammer, is very loosely based upon the prophecy. Every other chapter of Lord of the Hammer is pretty much an adaptation and reinterpretation of events that have already happened in the game. These events, as I've said before, are outlined in the prophecy. Chapter 1 of Lord of the Hammer is based around us getting Susie to join our team and stopping the king. And since Susie is very likely based on a dragon, stopping the dragon makes sense. Chapter 2 describes battling in chariots to save the queen, which is kind of reminiscent of the Birdly fight, or one could even argue that it resembles the Giga Queen battle. However, in this case, instead of saving the queen, we're trying to save Noelle. Chapter 4 of Lord of the Hammer is probably the easiest one to pinpoint down. It's based around the fight with Gerson in this moment, and so given all of this, you would think that Chapter 3 of Lord of the Hammer would focus on some sort of contest of some kind, since Chapter 3 is like one big game show. But instead, no, it focuses on this small little piece of side content. This is extremely unusual for the prophecy. While Chapter 4 of Lord of the Hammer focuses on the chapter's Shadow Crystal boss, it's also by far the easiest of all the secret bosses to come across. And plus, in the chapter regardless, there's still one mandatory Gerson-like boss, that of course being the old man statue. And outside of that, the prophecy from what we've seen does not outline any of the game's optional or secret events. And given that, as far as we know, the prophecy has not been majorly subverted yet, it makes you wonder, why was it this specific area that Chapter 3 of Lord of the Hammer focused on? In addition to all of this, the door that you can find that you have to unlock with the ice key you got has 4 different triangles on it. Granted, the 4th one may just be part of a keyhole, but my point still stands. This had to have been a deliberate choice. It's believed that each of the 3 triangles on the main Deltarune logo itself represents one of the 3 heroes from the prophecy. That is, at least until you realize there's 4 characters who could be heroes from the prophecy. Of course, there's our usual fun gang, Chris, Susie, and Ralsei. However, there's a 4th character mentioned in the prophecy, quote, "At last was the girl." Another panel before it previously mentions the girl with hope crossed on her heart, but these 2 panels seem to be referring to different characters. Some have argued that the second girl could be Susie. After all, the icon for her Rude Buster attack shows up on the panel. However, there's just not enough evidence to say for sure whether or not she is. It could be another character, but there's also evidence that contradicts that. I have a feeling that it was worded this vaguely on purpose. However, the part that mentions just the girl may not even be part of the prophecy that names the main heroes. It could be a different section of the prophecy altogether. But still, who could this 4th triangle be representing? There's one other party member we end up gaining in Chapter 2 who joins us for a period of time. The only other character outside of the main trio who fights alongside us in combat. That character is, of course, Noelle Holiday. We're probably going to be seeing her at the festival during Chapter 5, regardless of whether we play through the weird route or the normal route. On the normal route, she's going with Susie, and on the weird route, she's going with Chris. But Susie is definitely going to be accompanying us in both versions. And since she has programmed in reactions for weapons and armor that are currently not equipable on her in Chapter 2, I personally find it extremely likely that she'll be joining our Dark World party again at some point. So it's possible that the fourth triangle could be representing Noelle. After all, she does seem to be a very, very important character for the story of Deltarune, which is even further reinforced by this moment from the Undertale 10th anniversary stream.
Classic line.
No else matters. No one else matters. No one else matters. No one else matters.
The bear's really good.
That wasn't a mistake. That was intentional. As soon as Noelle was on screen for a little bit, Toby Fox kept repeating, "No one else matters." This would make sense for the weird route, as the entire route focuses around us using and manipulating Noelle for our own gain. But for the normal route, that's a lot more uncertain. Why would Noelle serve so much importance to the entire story of Deltarune on the normal route? We know that she's the daughter of Carol, who is very, very likely working with the Knight, and she is the younger sister of December Holiday, who is very likely to be the Knight, and December's disappearance seems to be the defining moment for the game's plot, but other than that, we don't really know anything of why she would be of so much importance. Then, something struck me. Our trio of heroes was never truly a trio. There's one other member of the group that we didn't talk about before. The prophecy panel that describes Chris is weird, to say the least. It's probably the most vague description out of all of the heroes. All it refers to Chris as is just the cage with human soul and parts. The description given to Chris is not only vague and cryptic, but it's also dehumanizing. It treats Chris as just nothing more than an object. A tool to be used, the container for a soul that just happens to have human parts. It even further strips Chris of their agency with the language used. At first, I was wondering why the prophecy used this specific language to refer to Chris. Why not just refer to them as the carrier of the human soul? But then, something struck me. What exactly is a vessel without the soul that puppeteers it? Throughout the entire game so far, we've seen the Fun Gang pull off some genuinely incredible feats. However, none of it would have even been possible without our involvement. The involvement of us, the soul, the player. In Chapter 4 especially, the soul itself gets directly involved with saving the Fun Gang. Perhaps the #1 biggest example of this is when we defeat the Titan. Granted, we couldn't have done this without the help of Susie and Chris, but it's still us who directly banishes the Titan. It's still us who seals the Dark Fountain at its core. This is a moment where the soul directly defeats an enemy. So not only is the soul completely separate from Chris, as has been established multiple times in the game by this point, but the soul is also just as, if not even more important than the main trio, and it makes sense. The soul is us, the player of the game, the one who guides our three heroes every step of the way. So naturally, it would make sense if we were the fourth triangle. I'm personally under the belief that the player is the angel mentioned in the prophecy, but that doesn't mean that the player can't also be the fourth member of the group. And so my stance is that the fourth triangle likely represents us, the one playing the game, the one who commands the other three heroes. And so, if that's the case, it would explain why it's so significant to the prophecy. It relates directly back to us, the Angel, and the fourth member of the group. From this point on, the minigame only gets more and more bizarre. It gets more and more unsettling, and it reveals an alternate path for us, the Angel, to take. One that changes the direction of the story. And in order to get access to this knowledge, we have to use the ice key. You have now entered the Forbidden Area, the Ice Palace. This is where the bulk of the second board of the MANTLE minigame takes place. Notably, the music here bears a striking resemblance to one of the unused tracks in Undertale's secret sound test area. The specific track in question is Meat Factory. Interestingly enough, it also bears a striking resemblance to the Face Shrine music from the original Game Boy version of The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. The stuff related to the sound test room, I don't think I need to go into that much detail about. The sound test room is very much tied to Gaster, and that's pretty clear already, so it just adds further ties to Gaster with this minigame. The part that I want to focus on is the inspiration from the Face Shrine music. For those who haven't played Link's Awakening, the Face Shrine is the game's 6th dungeon, and it also comes after perhaps the most crucial moment in the entire game's story. It's after we find out through a mural within the area that the entirety of Koholint Island where the game is set is just an illusion, a dream created by the Windfish. So if we collect all of the instruments and wake the Windfish and defeat the nightmare, we'll have completed our mission, but Koholint Island, along with everybody living on it, will vanish. In a very similar way to this plot reveal, at the beginning of Chapter 3, we learn what the true nature of the Dark Worlds is. Illusions created by the Dark Fountains. The stuff in the Dark Worlds is, at least from Rousei's perspective, not reality. And so if we complete our mission in the Dark Worlds and seal the Dark Fountain at their core, we'll have completed our mission, but the entire Dark World will vanish. It'll return to just what it was previously before the fountain was made. Of course, the different Dark Worlds have a more tangible realism to them when compared with Koholint Island. The stuff in the Dark Worlds very much does actually happen, and it's not fake. Both the light and dark worlds have a tangible effect on one another, and additionally, unlike in Koholint Island, the residents of the dark worlds aren't inherently doomed by their dark fountains being closed. Once the dark fountains are closed, we can just gather up all the objects in the room and then take them over into the castle town. There, the Darkners will be reborn yet again. So, unlike Koholint Island, completing our mission and sealing the Dark Fountains doesn't necessarily doom the Darkners living in the Dark Worlds. But regardless, my point still stands in that the Dark Worlds and Koholint Island have a clear parallel to one another. The form of both worlds is only maintained through some sort of magical process. For Koholint Island, it's the slumber of the Windfish inside its egg. For the Dark Worlds, it's the Dark Fountains flowing. If the Windfish is awoken, or if the Dark Fountain is sealed for each respective world, then the world in question will cease to exist. Just like how the Face Shrine is entered after finding this information out in Link's Awakening, the Ice Palace is entered in Deltarune right after finding out about the true nature of the Dark Worlds. The parallels between these two implies something about Chris. In Link's Awakening, once it's discovered what the true nature of Koholint Island is, Link is noticeably hesitant to continue going with the mission. He's hesitant to complete his quest because he knows that if he does, the entirety of the world he's grown attached to in this game will be gone. In Deltarune, multiple characters up to this point have already toyed with the idea of not wanting to seal the Dark Fountains, not wanting the adventures to come to an end. Given just how alone and depressed Chris is in the Light World, it would make sense if now they're hesitant to seal the Dark Fountains. If they don't want the adventures to end because then they'll have to go back to regular life. This is of course just speculation, however I felt that it was worth pointing out because of the parallels between the two. Inside the Ice Palace, you'll find two messages left for you. One of them says that the, quote, forbidden path began with ice magic. This might put you in mind of a certain alternate route that's available in Chapter 2. The second message compounds this further when it tells us to follow the White Hood. There's only one character known for wearing white robes in the entire game, Noelle, and you'll end up finding the 8-bit version of her once you've reached the maximum level. From there, reaching the end of the Ice Palace is just a matter of backtracking and freezing all of the enemies you couldn't kill before, much like how in the Weird Route you have to backtrack and use Ice Shock on all of the enemies. This culminates in you eventually freezing a bluebird that blocks the way to a new area, much like how you force Noelle to cast Snowgrave onto Birdly. It's worth noting too that this doesn't just seem to be a parallel to the Weird Route. There's only one thing that we know has been leaving messages for us so far in this minigame, and we know that whatever it is, it's been following us throughout the minigame. This entity is actively leaving instructions for how to activate the Weird Route. Whatever it is isn't just a neutral party in the game's story, it's actively trying to push us, the player, towards the Weird Route. For whatever reason, it wants us to play through the Weird Route. The reason why is currently unknown, but this establishes that whatever this thing is, it is very sinister in nature, and that when it comes to its intentions, it cannot be trusted. The fact that this thing knows about the Weird Route too means that it would have to know about the existence of the soul, and by extension, the player, making it among a very, very tiny pool of characters that is fully aware of what Chris's situation is. The fact that it wants us to pursue the Weird Route too shows that it does not have Chris's best interests at heart, and eventually, we get to meet it again, behind a horned, locked door.
There's nothing as well, is there?
It says this almost as a challenge, like it's daring us to venture in further and find something.
Oh, you found that too? Just perfect. Thank you for all your hard work, Chris.
From there, we can piece together a little more information about this entity. Firstly, it seems to have a very smug and cocky personality. The way it brings up the possibility of there being anything in its secret hiding place feels almost as though it's taunting us. But it also speaks as though it's known Chris for a very long time, long before we ever got involved in the story. And the idea of Chris and Noelle being used up fits with how we treat both of them during the Weird Route. We essentially use Noelle in Chapter 2 to freeze all the enemies, including Birdly, and at the end of Chapter 2, we use her once again to freeze over Spamton Neo. We essentially just use her as a tool for our own gain, and so by the end of the chapter, she ends up being used up by us. The second message is a little less clear. The fact that it refers to the recipient of the message in the second person would seem to imply that it's communicating directly to us, the player of Deltarune. However, the entity's usage of the second person seems to have been directed at Chris, not us. So given this context, as well as the fact that Chris turns around to face us after that message is said, I personally believe that it's referring to Chris being used up, not the soul. If that's the case, then I can definitely see why Chris would turn around to face us after that message. They might genuinely be scared. Now, I'm not saying we're necessarily some evil person for playing the game. That's definitely not the message that Toby Fox is trying to send. And it's worth pointing out because I know somebody will. Chris does not exactly treat the soul very good during the normal route of the game. I bring this up because a lot of people have used it to try to justify the weird route. And true, Chris does not treat the soul very well, but try to think of this from their perspective. They're still a teenager. They're dealing with a lot of stuff mentally too, and teenagers are already not exactly known for their emotional stability. Now add that on top of them being extremely depressed, not really having that many friends, and having a lot of their autonomy stripped away by an extra-dimensional entity using their body as a vessel. Sure, they still retain a little bit of agency with us, and they can control how they go about the tasks we direct them to do, but at the same time, they still have to do what we tell them to. And on top of that, they have no way of directly communicating with us, just like how we have no way of directly communicating with them. So, how are they supposed to know what our intentions are? Of course, this does not absolve Chris of any of their actions, but at the same time, I understand why they're suspicious of us and why they want to keep their guard up around us. This doesn't necessarily make us evil either, because ultimately we didn't choose to inhabit Chris, just like how Chris didn't choose to be possessed by us. In the situation, neither party is truly right nor wrong. That's the thing with the whole situation, it's not black and white, it's complex. Chris is neither some sort of innocent, pure little saint, nor are they evil incarnate. What they are is a genuinely troubled kid with a broken home. Someone who is very heavily implied to have some repressed trauma that they're trying to cover up. Somebody with plenty of demons who needs help. There is another possibility that the opening of the horned door could be alluding to future events in the weird route. We know that the entity has some sort of connection to the shelter in Hometown based on it having the shelter key. And since it's very likely, in my opinion, that during the weird route we transferred a piece of the soul onto Noelle, could it be that in the future of the weird route we end up taking full control of her in order to access the shelter? Of course, this would end up happening once she becomes more powerful than everybody else. If this were the case, it would explain Noelle being used up. We would use her to grind up EXP and LV, to the point where eventually she'd become a suitable vessel for us. It would also explain why Chris would be used up. They would only be used temporarily for us as a momentary vessel until we're able to take over Noelle, and once Chris has outlived their usefulness, we end up leaving their body. On one hand, this would give Chris their autonomy back, but on the other hand, it's stated in-game that they tend to become more fatigued the longer they go without a soul, and it's implied from phone calls that it's dangerous for Chris to enter a dark world without their soul. And since Chris would eventually have to enter a dark world at some point, this could potentially end up being lethal for them. This is what I personally believe it's trying to say, and I also believe that Noelle will likely be the one to equip the Twisted Sword. However, there's one huge thing. The weird route seems to be a deviation from the prophecy, but we know the Isles of Northern Light are in the prophecy. Why would a location connected to the weird route be in the prophecy? Unfortunately, we don't really have an answer to that question at the moment, and I'm not really sure how to reconcile that. Whatever this entity is, too, seems to be connected to the shelter, and by extension, the Knight, and everybody else in the conspiracy. But unfortunately, from the stuff we have so far, we don't know enough yet to say much else about the entity. So, I think it's time to move on to the third part of the minigame. This time the third board we start on doesn't really correspond to any boards actually used in Chapter 3. It does correspond to an unused board for Chapter 3, but none that are actually used. To make things even stranger, the board bears a striking resemblance to the Cyber City from Chapter 2. This time, the 8-bit version of Chris isn't alone. Instead, they're followed by 8-bit versions of Susie and Ralsei. But during the majority of the Cyber City in Chapter 2, neither of them are with Chris. The sword from both previous parts of the minigame can be found here, but there's no way to increase your level because there's no enemies. Right? As it turns out, the 8-bit versions of Susie and Ralsei are counted in this game as enemies, and so you have to use the 8-bit version of Chris to turn around and kill them to increase your LV. The real version of Chris is very clearly not comfortable with this because when you do this, they flinch in response. Seeing even just a small 8-bit version of them hurting their friends makes them instinctively recoil. There's also a possibility that this could tie into the Chris Slash theory. For those who are unfamiliar, some people have theorized that at the end of the fight with the Roaring Knight, the one to swoon the party isn't actually the Knight, but instead Chris. There's a bunch of evidence both for and against it. Personally, I don't really believe in the theory, but I do think it is an interesting idea. If the theory is true, then it would recontextualize the moment in the Mantle minigame of having to kill both Susie and Ralsei. Instead of just being a creepy moment, it would instead make it a moment of foreshadowing, and it would add even more complex characterization to Chris as well. If the theory is true, then the minigame would show that Chris would very clearly not want to swoon the party. It's been shown many times in-game by this point that Chris really does care about their friends above all else. And so it would serve as a conflict between what their duty is and what their desires are. But even with that potential theory aside, this part of the minigame is still very mysterious. Why specifically a map that resembles the Cyber City? The minigame by this point is pretty clearly connected to the Weird Route, so how would this possibly connect to the Weird Route? Susie and Ralsei, even in the normal route, never really join us in the Cyber City until the end. And even in the Weird Route, Chris never actually harms either of them. There's a back alley section that resembles the alternative route to the Queen's Mansion found in the Weird Route, but the only person harmed to access it is Birdly. Susie and Ralsei are already at the Queen's Mansion by this point in the story, so why would you specifically have to harm them in order to gain access to this part? And adding on to this, why would you specifically need to kill any enemy? As of Chapter 4 in the Weird Route, Birdly hasn't died yet, and it's currently unknown if Birdly actually will die at any point on the Weird Route. And plus, even the Darkners frozen by Noelle's Ice Shock spell on the Weird Route are never actually confirmed to be dead. We don't know if they're actually dead, or if they're in a comatose state like Birdly is. Unfortunately, at this current point of the game, we don't really have any answers for this part of the minigame. We can theorize on them later, but for right now, there's no actual concrete answer. For now, all we can really do is just proceed further and enter the manhole cover at the end of the alleyway. We have now entered the last area of the minigame, an area that, from this point onward, I will be referring to as the Roots Dungeon. This is due to the area's soundtrack name, Bit Roots. The music itself is an 8-bit version of another area track, Digital Roots. This is interesting because of where Digital Roots plays. Digital Roots plays in the Queen's basement during the Spamton Neo side quest of Chapter 2. The basement not only contains the Spamton Neo robot, and by extension the secret boss fight with Spamton Neo, but it's also specifically the area where Device_Friend was sighted for the first time. Even more strangely, both areas look very similar visually as well. Not to mention that the Digital Roots area is underneath the Queen's Mansion and by extension the Cyber City, just like how the Roots dungeon is underneath the city board right above it. But there's two very big things to note. Firstly, the Roots dungeon is accessed directly from a manhole, but the manhole on the Weird Route of Chapter 2 leads to the entrance of the Queen's Mansion, and on the Weird Route, the basement is not accessible. Granted, this could very well be explained by the manhole leading to the basement, which then leads to a different manhole that pops out at the front of the mansion. However, there's no actual evidence of this. This is just an assumption I'm making that might explain that. And regardless, it still wouldn't explain away the second, much bigger inconsistency between the two. The layout of the Roots dungeon and the layout of the Queen's basement are nothing like each other. The Queen's basement is almost entirely made up of just a few hallways with some rooms. The basement as a whole is also almost entirely devoid of any entities or branching paths. Meanwhile, the Roots dungeon has an abundance of enemies, and instead of being just a few hallways with some rooms, it's a whole bunch of rooms all connected to each other. The two areas are almost identical visually and in terms of their theming, but in every other aspect, they're polar opposites. So how can this possibly be the same area? Then I realized the hallway at the end of the Roots dungeon very strongly resembles the hallway at the beginning of the Queen's basement, so instead they may be two different parts of the same area, or at least recreations of it. There's a video made by GoldPro that goes into a lot more details about this called Roots Theory. Basically, the theory proposes that both are recreations of part of a later area. I'll link it down below in the description because on top of being a very plausible theory, it's also just a genuinely well-made video. The video also points out one key thing about the layout of the Roots dungeon in particular, though. A lot of the monsters resemble characters from Hometown, and in addition, the layout very closely resembles that of the Hometown. The Roots dungeon is mostly just a killing spree with all of the enemies. However, there is one room that does have a puzzle. Basically, at the other side of the room, there's a black monster sprite that's unkillable, and you can't reach it either. However, it does mirror the movements you specifically make with the 8-bit Chris. With this in mind, you have to maneuver it onto a switch while also stepping on a switch on your side of the room as well. You then briefly gain control of the monster, and you have to move towards the 8-bit Chris, who will then automatically turn around and kill it. It's unknown exactly how you're able to suddenly take control of it when the puzzle's over, however, this one room does have some very compelling evidence in my opinion for the Death's Night theory. In the game's code, there's a fully finished second set of sprites for this monster. They all depict a black deer specifically. They're fully functional in the game, and when it's using the black deer set, the monster's able to be hit with the sword. However, you're never going to actually see this in a normal run of the game because of one thing. There's a variable in the code named Toriel. When Toriel is set to false, then the monster uses the black deer set, but if Toriel is set to true, then it'll just use the monster set and will not be hittable. However, this specific check for the variable will always have one specific outcome because the first line of code under the monster's data will always set the Toriel variable to true. I am by no means an expert on programming. The most amount of experience I have is just a couple of computer science/programming classes I'm currently enrolled in. However, with that said, if this were truly just meant to be a piece of unused content nobody would really think too much about, then it would be far simpler to just delete the lines of code related to the Toriel variable as well as the sprites. There would be no need to still include a check for the variable if it truly wasn't meant to be used. At best, it would just take up unnecessary space in the game's programming. But then you remember, Toby Fox has a history of hiding secrets in the game's code. And really, there's only one other character with black as its primary color that has deer-like antlers, the Knight. And there's only one member of the Holiday family with the color black tied to them, December. I'm unsure of what specific role Toriel would play in all of this, however, it's clear that the Knight does want Toriel for whatever reason. And based on her dialogue with Rudy during the church portion of the Light World section of Chapter 4, it definitely seems as though Toriel knows a lot more than she lets on about the whole situation with the Knight and the shelter. Chris attacking the monster representing the Knight may imply that in the future they could end up betraying the Knight, however, I'm not 100% sure about this. This is all pretty much just raw speculation. If you have any thoughts on this, please let me know in the comments. And at the end of the Roots dungeon, there's an 8-bit version of Tenna that you'll briefly hear dialogue from.
How did things turn out like this? Keeping poor Toriel all locked up. If only he hadn't abandoned me, my old partner. I was gonna put him on TV, make him a star. I gave him everything I had, my life advice. All he had to do was tell me what his secret was, his secret to being a big shot. It took a little sweet talk, but just what I had. Finally, got him to sign the deal. He suddenly had to take a phone call. But when he picked it up, his face turned pale, and he ran right out the room with the receiver hanging. So I went to pick it up, thinking it was finally my chance to be a big shot. But there was nobody there. That little freak ripped me off. I wish they never brought that laptop home. Chris, I didn't see you there. I did what you said, Chris. Just like our deal. You aren't going to turn me off again, are you?
And so we get even more lore for Tenna and Spamton. At some point before the game, both of them knew each other. However, I do not think that Tenna was the mysterious voice on the phone that helped Spamton succeed. Based on the way this is phrased, it seems that this event happened after Spamton's initial rise to success. So as of right now, the voice on the phone that helped Spamton is still very much mysterious. However, Spamton and Tenna were very much business partners, if not in a romantic relationship. They were about to make a deal with one another that would help both of them out, but then something happened. In my opinion, I think the phone call was very likely Spamton's eviction notice following his business failing. He probably took the call because he was hoping it was the mysterious voice on the phone that had suddenly stopped calling him. But instead, in a cruel twist of fate, it was his notice that he was getting evicted. However, Tenna also seems to be notably afraid of Chris. He mentions a deal that both of them made, and I think I know what this deal probably was. Before the events of Chapter 3, Chris and Tenna probably made a deal that Tenna would keep the Lightners occupied and busy until the Knight could show up. And given the reaction from Spamton whenever you try bringing up the Knight and he almost reveals a secret about it, I think it's very likely that Chris threatened or blackmailed Tenna in some way. Given all of the evidence that Chris is working with the Knight, and Tenna seemingly being afraid of Chris, I think this tracks. But with all of that having been said, it's time to exit the Roots dungeon and enter the final stretch of the Mantle minigame. The shelter at the south of Hometown is now within our reach. Notably in this moment, Chris tries to wrestle control away from us. Whatever is down in the shelter, Chris does not want us to see. And even more so, Chris may even be afraid of whatever's down there. The shelter is almost pitch black. Navigating through the tight corridors, you may begin to wonder if you're truly alone. And as it turns out, you're not.
Playing around with this. That's why you're searching for it, aren't you? The shadow crystals and the shadow that unfolded. Do you honestly think it will get you what you want? No. Part of you is just enjoying this, isn't it? The same part of you that enjoyed this. No, you could say, wasn't really you. Oh, don't make that sound, babies. I can see the dark now. The question is, can you?
And so the boss fight against the ghost in the machine, Eram, begins. Eram may genuinely be the most enigmatic character in all of Deltarune. If I could describe it with just one word, it would be anomaly. We know next to nothing about this thing. It's also the only entity in any of the 8-bit minigames that's not only able to damage you in the minigame, but it's also able to inflict damage on the soul outside of the minigame. This thing very clearly is more than just a video game enemy. There is something supernatural going on with Eram, hence why I referred to it as the ghost in the machine. Additionally, it seems to have not just been stalking Chris throughout the minigame, it also seems to have been following us throughout the other Dark Worlds. The line it says about Chris enjoying the events of the minigame just like how they enjoyed yesterday only happens if you've done the weird route for Chapter 2. There is no way this thing would have been able to know about the events of the weird route on Chapter 2 unless it was following us. Based around the way this thing moves during the fight as well, I think it's very likely that it's actively wearing the Shadow Mantle as we fight it, but there's no signs of a body underneath the Shadow Mantle. Because of this, as well as the fact that we only ever find Eram in dark areas such as the shelter, I personally believe that the physical body underneath the Shadow Mantle is likely formless. Darkness in Deltarune has been compared many times with water. Perhaps the biggest example of water-related imagery being tied to darkness is with the dark fountains themselves. If Eram only really resides in dark areas, it's possible that Eram itself is made out of darkness. And since darkness has been shown to behave like a liquid, which by definition is formless unless contained, it would make complete sense that Eram itself would also be formless. The only reason it would have a defined shape is because of it wearing the Shadow Mantle. Just like a liquid, the darkness of Eram's body would conform to the shape of the container, in this case the Shadow Mantle itself. However, the specific line related to the weird route also carries some dark implications about Chris. It's one of many hints in the game that Chris has some violent tendencies, ones that they're actively trying to repress throughout the game. So even though they don't actively enjoy us doing the weird route, deep down, there's a part of them that does. Eram is also able to summon different clones of Device_Friend during the fight. Since we know Device_Friend would have to be connected to Dess's disappearance as well as the whole motif of roots, that would connect Eram to it as well. And since they would both be connected to Dess's disappearance, that would mean that... Okay, I'm gonna have to be honest with you all with how I make my videos. I've never once scripted a single one of my videos before. It just feels more genuine for me to be talking as I go along. I understand why a lot of other YouTubers script their videos, but personally, I just prefer not to. The reason I'm saying this is because what you just heard was me coming to a realization in real time. I don't know if any other Deltarune content creator has really, brought this up before, but just hear me out for a second, okay? Just let me state what I'm thinking. So, the forgotten man who hides behind the tree who gives us eggs in Deltarune. We know, especially based on Chapter 4, that the Eggman is likely linked to some sort of repressed traumatic memory for Chris. And we also know that in the Roots room in Chapter 4, the one with the prophecy that just says Roots, there's a jumbled up sentence that, when rearranged, says, "Lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail, the poor children," and all that kind of stuff. And so, both would be linked to Dessa's disappearance. It would lead back to that tree. So, what if the whole thing with Roots is referring to the roots of the tree that the Forgotten Man is hiding behind? And so, the thing that was traumatic for Chris wasn't behind the tree, or at least wasn't just behind the tree, but also underneath it within its roots. I'm honestly really surprised that I didn't make this connection before. I might be onto something, I'm not sure. It might be a coincidence, I don't know. I just really wanted to share this because I didn't think about this before. So, yeah, anyway, enough of my completely unplanned, mostly unedited little side tangent here, back to the analysis. Another connection Eram has to the night as well is the actual battle music. The battle theme for Eram, Burning Eyes, bears a striking resemblance to the Knight's battle theme, Black Knife. When you listen to the opening of both songs side by side, they're almost identical. I also decided to look up the definition of MANTLE, seeing as Eram has hold of it during this fight. I wanted to see if there were any specifics in the definition that I was missing. According to Merriam-Webster, a mantle can be a piece of clothing similar to a cloak or a cape. However, it can also be a figure of speech used to refer to leadership or authority of something. Merriam-Webster also gives a few definitions of the word knight. The exact specifics vary, but the first two definitions refer to a mounted man-at-arms serving a feudal superior, or a man devoted to the service of a lady as her attendant or champion. So connecting the dots a little bit, we can deduce that whatever Eram is, it is superior to the Roaring Knight in terms of its rank, and given that it summons Friend throughout the fight, we can also deduce that Friend is under the service of Eram, or at the very least, in terms of the hierarchy, it ranks lower. This then leaves us with one question. What exactly is Eram? Fellow Deltarune content creator Nighthawk actually made a really interesting theory video discussing this, which I'll link down below in the description, and I'd recommend you check out in full. But to summarize, the theory posits that Eram is actually the manifestation of Noelle's imaginary friend. I personally think it's a very interesting possibility, however, I don't really believe it for a few reasons. Firstly, Eram is very likely connected to Dessa's disappearance, if not responsible, and I highly doubt that would really be the case if it actually was Noelle's imaginary friend, especially since Dessa's disappearance has clearly been something that Noelle has been grieving a lot, and I doubt an imaginary friend would really want to cause pain to the person who came up with them. And my second, bigger reason is because of how much Eram has pushed the weird route at this point. If Eram really was Noelle's imaginary friend, I feel like it would want to do stuff that's in her best interest. And in my personal opinion, traumatizing the reindeer is definitely not in her best interest. However, this is not meant to discredit Nighthawk or his theory in any way. The video is overall very interesting, and I like the idea behind the theory even if I personally don't agree with it. I personally have my own crack theory as to what Eram is, however, that's for another day. Either way, this thing seems to be an authority in the whole hierarchy of the Roaring Knight group, and it definitely seems to know more than we or Chris do. And the ties to Gaster are even further amplified because this thing's in the bunker. You know, one of the most gaster-coated areas in all of Deltarune. But regardless of whatever Eram is, eventually, the 8-bit version of it goes down just like any other boss fight in the game.
That's what I want to see. Flickering red, like pretty little flames. Your eyes can't hide it, Chris. Without play, the knife grows dull. Well, enough of that. We both have work to do. So, if you want this mantle, hurry up and take it. If you can reach it.
The only chest in the room is too high up for the 8-bit version of Chris to reach, so our only option is to move to the right of the screen. Somehow, even though this shouldn't even be possible, we're able to move the 8-bit version of Chris outside of the game. At this point, Chris hasn't taken the soul out of their body. We should only be able to control them, yet somehow, we're able to move the 8-bit version of them as though they were Chris themselves. Eventually, we have to move this miniature version of Chris off screen, and then just like how the 8-bit version of Chris did, the real Chris can also break the fourth wall, and in doing so, collect the Shadow Mantle. This leaves us with just one question. What the hell does this minigame mean? The first board seems to be the game before the weird route can be activated, where it assumes the player is fighting all of the enemies, and the ice key would represent the knowledge of the weird route. Board 2 would be pretty cut and dry, being the events of the weird route itself. So what about board 3? For a while, I was completely stuck on this question. I had no idea what board 3 could possibly represent in relation to the weird route. What could it mean? How is it related to the weird route? Just how? Then, I decided to look at some other information we have regarding the weird route. Specifically, the one piece of music related to the weird route that we know is going to be in Chapter 5. A very short audio excerpt known as H.OGG. The short excerpt we have sounds like a much more somber and melancholic version of the Hometown theme's opening. Then I started to think back about how the Roots Dungeon's layout strongly resembles the layout of Hometown. Then a new possibility, a new explanation, dawned on me. What if the third board isn't telling us what happens now in the weird route or what's happened in the past on the weird route? What if instead, it's telling us what will happen on the weird route? In this interpretation, the city portion of the map wouldn't represent the Cyber City as I stated before. Instead, it would represent the Castle Town. For the entirety of the weird route so far, we focused exclusively on powering up Noelle. But she's not the only party member we need to focus on, nor is she the only one. Our main party member, the Commander, is Chris, and we can't neglect powering them up as well. And what stronger enemies would there be than the two party members who have joined them through thick and thin, who fought alongside them against a tyrannical king, an egotistical queen, a terrified game show host, and the embodiment of fear itself, a titan. The amount of EXP these two would give would be maddening. What better cattle could there be to the slaughter in the name of our strength? But we're not done with our two companions yet. Outside of the castle town, there remains another town, an entire farmland of fresh EXP, waiting to be picked clean. But in our attempts to use our two little toys to defy the prophecy, we end up playing directly into Eram's hands. We've defied the prophecy, only to end up aiding the same monster responsible for the events of the game to begin with. We've successfully avoided the final tragedy told in the prophecy, but now the fate that awaits us is far, far worse than the tragedy we were trying to escape. And the breadcrumb trail that led us here was laid in the minigame called MANTLE. So, that was my analysis of MANTLE, Deltarune's most disturbing minigame in my opinion. I apologize if anything I said seemed a bit out there. There were a lot of ideas I had while making this video. Ideas that I'll probably share at some other point in time. I really did enjoy making this video, and I tried my best to improve upon the Snowgrave video that got my channel as popular as it is right now. I would like to thank everybody watching this for being patient with me. I know I take a while in between videos, trust me, I wish I could do better with that, but I'm doing my best right now. Moving forward, my channel's going to be mainly focused on Deltarune content because, for one thing, it's my favorite game of all time and I really do love it. And for another thing, I know that's the kind of content that would make you guys happy. I really love doing YouTube as a hobby. It gives me a reason and a space to be able to talk about things that I genuinely love. And having a community as kind and understanding as this makes it all worth it in my opinion. To everybody in my community watching this, sincerely, thank you, and I love you all. And to everybody else, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like my style of content, feel free to check my channel out, but you don't have to. I think it's time I wrap up the video. So, I love you all, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.